Hey everybody, welcome to the Big Liberty Show, part 3 of a 3-part mini-series as we look at the taxi industry in this country. Taxiland is coming to you via the Big Liberty Show, of course, with a special thanks to our partners and friends at the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. Shout out to you guys for supporting the work that we do. I am not alone, of course. I'm joined by perhaps someone who's more well-known in the literary world, especially as a columnist and an opinionista, Ivo Vegter. Ivo, of course, has penned this wonderful report which brings us here today as we look at the taxi industry in depth, from its history to what it is to operate in this industry today with the regulatory burden, etc., etc., and of course, make some great recommendations around what we can do to modernize the industry and really to improve it. Again, you guys know I'm a big proponent, a big fan of the taxi industry in this country because unlike the lip service paid by politicians, this is actually a quote-unquote 100% black-owned industry. And really what the more important thing, other than the racial element of it, which is not that important, is it's 100% privately owned. I mean, this is an industry that grew from a seedling to becoming this estimated 90 billion rand a year industry in this country. But let me not waffle away and let me welcome my guest, Ivo. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Thanks very much. You play very well, and you?
Good to have you, man. Like, I feel like this is long in the making. Ivo, let's hop straight into it. You've penned this wonderful report, which the link of which I'll put onto the screen so people can read it. It speaks about an industry which is so often so maligned by the sort of traditional media and really the mainstream media, and even by politicians, to be brutally honest with you. But this is an important industry, isn't it?
Oh, it's a critical industry. It's a strange industry in a way, because on one hand, what you said is absolutely right. It's this free market industry which developed. It really started in the late 70s as a reaction to apartheid spatial planning. Where they basically put the black workforce out in townships on the edges of towns, peri-urban areas, very far away from work. They tried to subsidize buses and trains in those days, but it really wasn't sufficient, wasn't adequate for to really cater for the needs, the commuting needs of the black people in the townships.
Absolutely, which is a growing population.
So they initially the industry was completely illegal. They started some sort of deregulation in round about the Soweto riots time, 76, 77. When they did the first deregulation, they started issuing some permits, but it was still very hard to get permits in those days. So there were still very few taxis on the road. Government at first didn't know exactly how to handle this. And it's interesting when you look at the history. When you go back to the 80s, they had several sort of commissions to look into the taxi industry and how to handle it. One said they should ban minibus taxis altogether. Which incidentally they've done in London. That's why we have black cabs in London and not minibus taxis. A number of cities have actually, or countries have actually done that. They outlawed the minibus commuter industry. So the one proposal was to outlaw the taxis. The other proposal, which came out around about the same time, only a few months later, was said no. The taxis should have their time in the sun, and we should license 16-seater minibus taxis, and let the industry develop. And the reason they gave was interesting. Was that if they'd cracked down on the taxi industry, then it would give a bad name to popular capitalism,
Which was all the rage back then.
Well, it was interesting. I mean, I never really saw the National Party as all that capitalist. They had a lot of socialist ideas.
That's right.
and protectionist ideas. They obviously benefited the white population, but the idea of job reservation and a big civil service to employ white people and so on, those are very socialist ideas. But it was the era of Reagan and Maggie Thatcher. So they did try to promote the idea of free enterprise and capitalism in those days. So that eventually led to the deregulation in the industry in 87. And from there it boomed, and it became a really great industry. It was interesting because there are no schedules, there's no written schedules, there's nothing formal about the industry at all. It sort of developed organically, and it was very efficient, actually.
Ivo, it's that efficiency, isn't it, which speaks to the efficacy of the industry and why it's been such a growing industry, and one which really follows the customer as opposed to subsidized transport, which basically says, look, this is what we're subsidizing, it's this particular route or this particular rail line, and you guys, that's the commuter, come to it. Whereas these guys, they're classic entrepreneurs, aren't they?
Absolutely. You know, what you see with the taxi industry, it's great. Whenever you have a new development, you know, a new suburb being developed or a new shopping centre, or you know, the taxis are the first there.
Absolutely.
You know, they set up a new route or they modify a route, and they're there right from day one. Now, you can't do that with bus routes, or they don't do that with bus routes. And you can't do that with trains because you need to actually lay railway lines.
That's right.
So the government-run public transport systems are simply not flexible enough for what people really need, whereas the taxi industry was. It was incredibly flexible.
Let's zoom in on this aspect and others to an extent. And I want to probe you on something here, because let me get it out the way perhaps at the onset, because I know my viewers have been sort of chewing me on social media on this particular issue. Ivo, you and I are free marketeers in how we view society and what we want of society and business and the growth of commerce. But you have that usual trope that then says, well, you know, if you're saying the taxi industry is free marketeers, then look at what's happened when that is the case, right? It's violent, it's chaotic, it's unorganized, and it's run by, as one individual on my social media said, a mafia-esque type elite.
Yes.
My pushback, and I'll give you a moment to sort of rebut, my pushback is, well, you'll have elements of that, but this is where, therefore, the state is supposed to come in, insofar as law enforcement and the rule of law and a regulatory environment, which allows these entrepreneurs to operate freely. But for some people, that's not enough of an answer. They just associate free market and entrepreneurship like this with just thuggery and mafia and violence. How are they wrong, if at all they are wrong?
Well, it depends how you see free market. You know, a lot of people I know are anarchists. They don't believe in the state at all, and they think that everything that can be provided better by the free market than by the state, including justice, policing, and all of that. You know, they point to private security companies and say, why do we need police? You can get private arbitrators, so why do we need courts? I disagree. I do believe in the role of a relatively small state that basically protects life, liberty, and property. And this would be a perfect example, because yes, you do get mafia style activities. In fact, the taxi industry is a mafia style activity in many ways. They are very anti-competitive in the sense that they don't allow new competitors onto their routes. They believe that they have monopolies on routes, right? Which basically says that they have monopoly on a stretch of public road, which they obviously don't. If I want to drive a taxi on a piece of public road, then I should be entitled to do so. Right? So yes, this became a problem, and the government never really stepped in and said, well, you can't claim monopolies, you can't, and basically enforce the laws, basic criminal law, against taxi violence. What's worse, the government actually contributed to it in some ways.
That's right.
Because what they did when they started, they deregulated the industry, and then they started looking at violence in the taxi industry. And this was the time that the country was changing. We were in negotiations. The '94 elections were coming, and there were two sort of main reasons for the violence. Before '94, there was a big political aspect to the violence. So you could argue that a lot of the taxi violence victims were really victims of political violence. Right? And that had a lot to do with the way that the black population felt about public transport services, about bus subsidies that undercut taxis. It was a complicated sort of issue towards the end of apartheid. After that, it became much more simple anti-competitive violence. New taxi association tries to muscle in your routes, we go and shoot them. That was the time when they started forming what they call the mother bodies, which were associations of taxi associations that basically ran the whole business in a very organized mafia-style fashion. And they controlled the routes, and it was quite restrictive. The government then said, well, okay, we need to obviously do some regulation here. So what are we going to do? We're going to ally ourselves. We're going to recognise what was at the time the South African Black Taxi Association, and what would eventually in 2001 sort of evolved and became Santaco, the South African National Taxi Council, which still exists today. And that became the sole voice, the sole representative, legal representative of the taxi industry. They became involved in issuing taxi permits. I think they're now called operator licenses. So basically the government would issue operator licenses to the owners and the taxis that were approved by Santaco. Right, and through Santaco approved by the various associations. Right. With that operating license came a specific route. Right, so you were licensed to operate on a specific route and nowhere else. Right. So suddenly you got a formalization of what was sort of a mafia structure and an anti-competitive structure by the government, which was exactly the wrong thing to do. What they should have done is say, look, we're deregulating, we're not issuing specific routes, we're not limiting you to specific routes, and everyone just play nice like everyone else does. I mean, I struggle. Well, I don't struggle because I live in Sedgefield, but a lot of people struggle with with traffic in the mornings trying to get to work, and they sit in traffic for an hour and a half. They don't go shoot other people that try to use the road and cause them to be late for work.
And I wanted to butt in here because you've underscored exactly what the problem is, I think, and one which is actually echoed, funny enough, by the taxi owners or the taxi owner who I happened to interview, to say that there's this dog-eat-dog environment that isn't born out of it's not necessarily born out of not wanting to compete, but the feeling that certain pockets of the industry hold and are given preferential power over the other. Yes. And that preferential power invariably means being closest to political power. Yes. Because you're in favor, so to speak, you're part of the tender elite is how he described it. You're also given this disproportionate power to control the industry. Yes. And control essentially how your competitors operate. Yeah. Perhaps before we go to our first ad break, I want us to sort of quickly chew on this element, which I think you rightly bring up at this point, in terms of the role of how messy the role of the state can be when it interferes in something that grows organically. There is an argument to be made that when there's been great resistance by the industry to further government regulation and really impose regulations like, yes, do this, do that, be part of this great grand scheme, whether it's the BRT system or whatever the case may be. We'll go into that just now. I think how I want to phrase this question is thus. Do you feel as though, I don't know what the report brings out, but do you feel as though the taxi industry has been given a fair shake or a fair listening to by the state, in terms of the state saying, how would you guys want to operate and how can we as the state make that process easier? Or as the state come in as sort of a sledgehammer and say, this is what we want you guys to do, and we might pick winners and losers in the process of doing that?
Well, it's difficult. It's really difficult to say because, the way that the state has kind of agreed to work through Santaco, basically means that the state will do what Santaco says. Now, Santaco is in favor of taxi recapitalization, formalization of the industry, modernization of the industry. They're basically on the same side as the state in that sense. And we'll get to the reasons why the state wanted to formalize the industry. But that sort of leaves very little scope for the people that feel themselves to be outside of that, that aren't really represented by Santaco. That's right. And it doesn't leave space for new operators, for example. It's very hard for new operators to break into the industry. You can't just be an entrepreneur and buy a couple of combis and hope that you're going to run a taxi industry and build it from there. Because if you're not on the right side of your local taxi association and then ultimately Santaco, then you're not going to get operating licenses. You're going to be muscled out of routes that you'd like to take. So it's just not going to happen for you.
Ivo, let's park it here for a moment. Guys, I want to go to a short ad break as we pay our bills, as they say on mainstream media. I'll see you guys after the short break. Guys, welcome back to the Big Liberty Show. I'm in conversation with Ivo Vegter, who of course has put together this wonderful report on the taxi industry on behalf of the Institute of Race Relations. Shout out again to the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for funding this work. Ivo, before the break, we were talking about the role of the state and how essentially the state has tried to cajole and coerce, in some cases, the industry, or in other cases has imposed bad policy proposals that have had negative outcomes, essentially.
Yes.
Primarily giving some people in the industry the power to essentially issue operating permits, and that causes the tension because, how can you be regulated by someone you compete against, blah, 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 those sort of issues. We were really zooming in on the role of the state. Let me coax you in this direction. The state has also tried to sort of shape the industry, to modernize it, as we're saying, in support, of course, of this body called Santaco, into becoming a lot more modern, a lot more efficient, and blah, blah, blah. But it's not really worked, has it, insofar as what they're trying to impose on them, like things like the taxi recapitalization program or even the bus rapid transport. Can you talk to us about this?
No, it hasn't. With the taxi recapitalization program, you had the problem that although the government was willing to pay a subsidy for scrapping old taxis and replacing them with these nice new vans, a lot of people couldn't afford that.
Yeah.
Right? So there was immediate resistance among the taxi owners, and they feared that about 40,000 people, drivers, were going to be put out of work as a result. And that is a problem because now, of course, a lot of people outside the taxi recapitalization program aren't in the formal industry and aren't really protected. Often referred to as pirate taxis. So it's had a lot of negative impact on the industry in many ways. Alongside the simply replacing the minibuses, what the recapitalization program also tried to do was actually formalize the industry in a much more way. So corporatize the owners, the taxi owners, in a sense, so they could pay tax and be part of the formal economy, and then impose labor standards on drivers, because grant labor standards to drivers, right? So to protect the drivers from exploitation.
Right. I smirk at this point because it's a bit of a double-edged sword, and I'll push our guest in this direction as to why I think, and maybe he also thinks it's a double-edged sword. But actually, let me go there. Ivo, the viewers would have seen already an insert where I speak to taxi drivers themselves, and these guys say, look, we are not the most educated people. We would not find work in other parts. This is really the kind of work we can do, and it provides an income. That income, some of them were quoting, is about 600 Rand a week. So roughly about what, 2,000 some change a month. And of course the odd takings here and there. If they've met target plus, they usually sort of pocket the plus that I speak of.
Yes, that's an important part of the whole equation.
Absolutely.
Which I don't think the government even recognized.
And that's the thing. Why would someone like that be opposed to the state suddenly now saying, I'm here to help you, in inverted commas?
Well, if the state now imposes, or sets maximum working hours, for example, right? The way this works is it's a cash industry, right? And we can go into why it's a cash industry and why I think it'll stay a cash industry.
Let's do that.
But it's a cash industry, so the way it works basically is the driver drives a particular route. The route has a particular value target attached to it. This is how much money a driver needs to make in a day and in a week, and then he gets paid a small salary by the taxi owner for doing that and meeting that target.
Almost a basic in a way.
Yeah, that's a basic. Anything he does above that target, because it's a cash industry, right, the owner doesn't even know about it, right? So that becomes pure profit for the driver, right? And that can make a huge difference to their income, right? So a driver getting told that, oh no, we now have nice new labor laws, so to protect you from working these extra hours, driver's not interested.
Absolutely.
Right? The drivers were the first to reject the idea of formalizing the labor laws in the taxi industry, because they knew that would stop them from actually, putting in the extra effort and making a bit of extra money, which on an income of 2,500-3,000 Rand a month can make a huge difference to someone's life.
Absolutely. In fact, when I spoke to the taxi drivers themselves, these are not also let's dispel a quick myth here. These are not sort of dumb grunts, unthinking thugs, monsters, as you often hear on social media or in the media. Some of these guys are really attuned to policy issues in relation to their industry. Let's come to the issue of law enforcement very quickly.
Let me say something about that. I used to take taxis, right? Was in late 1990s. I didn't have a car. Lived fairly far away from work. So I took taxis for about a year or so. Right? I was actually quite impressed with the taxis.
Absolutely.
The taxi drivers were pretty competent drivers. Almost all of them. There were exceptions. Right? They were pretty responsible. Look, they were all under time pressure, not only from the owners and for their own pockets, but also because of passengers. Drive, stop here, stop there. Hurry up because I'm late for work.
And quickly, you're raising something again the drivers themselves said, which is, here's this individual who's dealing with multiple stress points, if you will, from having to meet a daily target, having to satisfy the needs of passengers who obviously have their own time pressures, et cetera, and having to do that as much as possible within the framework of the road rules. When a passenger says to you, short left, for example, some of these slang terms.
You need to find a spot to stop.
Absolutely. That you actually went through them into the report. Guys, I really encourage you to read the report. It gives you a good insight into the industry. Ivo, we got a little distracted. I think we're going to move into basically having a short conversation around the clumsiness of the regulation. We'd spoken about the taxi recapitalization process, why there's such resistance to trying to quote unquote formalize this industry, actually making it rather unaffordable for entrepreneurs. The other also came with the insistence that the industry must sort of conform to what the state had centrally planned. Ahead of the World Cup, you make mention of these bus rapid transport routes. Talk to us about them.
Yeah, that was another big development. That the government now wanted to plan all these transport systems, these public transport systems, and the taxis were going to feed into the bus systems, and the bus was going to feed into the train systems, like the Gautrain and the Metro Rail in Cape Town, and so on. And this was all going to be one lovely planned transport system that was going to serve everyone. Of course, the taxis took one look at these buses and said, no, we don't like them.
Absolutely.
So if you look at I think there were about 12 cities or so that they wanted to roll out the BRT systems, and they're really operational. There are about 4 or 5 of them. There's not that many, and they're certainly not as expansive, even where they do run. They're not as expansive as they were initially planned to be. And the simple reason is that the taxis wouldn't allow it. So now you've got to basically say to the taxi owners, look, we're now going to subcontract to you or make you shareholders in the bus system in order to recompense you for the routes that we're taking and the passengers we're taking away from you. So there's been great resistance to BRT as well, and it's really not been that wonderful, idyllic plan that the government had in mind.
But Ivo, this is a consequence, isn't it, of the state not listening to an established existing industry that basically competes freely, right? So let me be precise and specific. I mean, there's cases, and again, the drivers themselves were actually quite eloquent in explaining just how they recognize an inefficient thing when they see it. They look at these buses and they go, why is the state spending so much money on dedicated lanes, for instance, all this infrastructure for those guys, whereas they do the grunt work in terms of the percentage of passengers that commute on them, every day in this country. They do have a case, don't they?
Not to mention that the BRT systems are heavily subsidized. I think I can't remember the exact stat offhand, but I think it's something like 70%
you're right.
of the price of a BRT ticket is carried by the state. And the taxi drivers and taxi owners are going, and justifiably so, say, well, where's our subsidy? Why don't we get 70% of our fares covered by the state?
Hey guys, welcome back to the Big Liberty Show. As we go into the final segment of our chat with Ivo Vegter, who of course put together the taxi report on behalf of the Institute of Race Relations. Again, looking at the industry, and I think we're having a very fruitful conversation around this industry, and perhaps now we're sort of zooming it down towards what should be done? How do you modernize the industry, make it more efficient, and really allow hard-working entrepreneurs, especially the more honest chaps, to get a fair shake and to get an opportunity to grow their businesses and serve their customers? Ivo, we were talking before this break, and we were saying, look, it's going to be a cash industry for the foreseeable future because there's a resistance towards using these smart card jiggies that the state has been recommending. Why?
Well, they've been trying smart cards for a while, and it's both the government that wants to formalize the industry, but also technology companies have thought, well, it's a big industry, you can sell smart cards into the taxi industry, well, that'd be great, They tried, for the first time they tried in 1999, I think. That's the first reference I could find. And I remember I was a technology journalist at the time, so I covered some of it. And it almost immediately led to violence. It was just not, people just weren't accepting it. Now, there are a number of reasons why. The way the system would work, then, you have a passenger with a smart card gets preloaded with cash, pays for the taxi fare in the taxi on a little device. That device then registers the trips and the fares that the driver collects. The owner would then see, right, at the end of the day, the driver's collected so much, pays the driver a salary or a commission on the basis of that. And then that feeds into the financial systems of the owners, which are now nice and corporatized, and they pay their share of tax, etc., and it's all nice and audited. But there's resistance from a number of directions. We mentioned the drivers before, right? That they kind of like working with a specific target, and then being able to pocket however much they exceed the target by. Right? That's a great motivator for the drivers to stay on a cash basis. The other thing is something simple like buying lunch. Drivers need to buy lunch on the road, and if they don't have cash in their pockets, then, well, how are they going to do that? With all the fares coming in, you can say, well, look, I'm going to exceed my target. I'm going to make my target, so I can put a few rand towards a streetwise 2 for lunch. So it's very practical for them. For owners, a lot of owners resist corporatization for obvious reasons. Really, they have no particular interest in being audited and being subjected to taxation. So it makes perfect sense for them for some of them to resist it. And then, but then you got the passengers, and this is where you really hit the roadblock, because you can probably enforce these rules on the owners. You might be able to enforce it on the drivers, but you're dealing with the low end of the market, the poor end of the market, where people don't have formal bank accounts. They don't have smartphones, so you don't have payment systems through smartphones. That won't work. They often get paid in cash. Sometimes on a daily or weekly basis, your domestics and gardeners and so on. They don't want to preload a month's worth of taxi fares onto a card, because then that limits their use of that money. They can't dynamically sort of reallocate it where they need it. They also probably fear that it gets stolen or lost. If you have a month's worth of taxi fare on a card, that's a valuable item. So they have cash. They prefer to work with cash, and I don't think you're ever going to change that. You're going to get cards into a minority of passengers' hands, and I'm sorry, if you only deal with a minority of people, then it's not going to work, and it'll never take hold. And that's why it hasn't. They've tried it many times over the years. Santico is still trying. Trying to get electronic cash management systems into the taxis with smart cards and so on. It just hasn't taken root.
Which, of course, speaks to why the state has been so aggressive in trying to institute this, because it's been trying to sort of suck them into the sort of centrally planned policy plans, or centrally planned operations, such as the BRT, the bus rapid transport system, that we sort of alluded to in the previous segment.
Yes, that's why they want these guys to be formal corporations that can do business with and contract in. Yeah.
But one gets the impression, just as a side shoot, that no one's really listening to the industry, are they? Like, this industry has been saying for a while now two major arguments, and you yet to see these arguments or hear these arguments from the drivers I spoke to and the owners, which is no one really listens to us insofar as us being the taxi owners, in terms of saying, how about you support us based on what we're doing already, and making that a more regulated environment, safer, modern, as opposed to trying to impose these wonderfully highfalutin plans that are thought up by people who are not in the industry, really, to be honest, and are almost pie in the sky. I mean, we take them from other countries and try and...
Well, they are pie in the sky.
And essentially trying to impose them here.
These smart cities with all these wonderful public transport systems, you might be able to pull that off in a rich country where everyone has smartphones and bank accounts and everyone already transacts electronically. Maybe. You're never going to be able to do that in this country. But you're right. What you can do is you can better regulate what the industry already does. Let the industry take the lead.
Yeah.
And then say, well, what do we need to do? We need to enforce laws about unroadworthy vehicles.
Yep.
And they don't do that well enough. We need to
Well, just very briefly, sorry, I don't mean to disturb your train of thought. And this has to be said because it's a valid criticism that the drivers themselves make is law enforcement itself is incredibly corrupt.
Yes.
I mean, there are some guys who are saying, look, I'm one of the few taxi drivers who actually tries to do everything by the law, and if they give me a ticket, I can't afford it, but I'll try and pay something. But if it means I can bribe some officer with a cold drink and a pie on the side of the road, then I'll do it.
Which is routinely done.
Absolutely.
I mean, and I've seen that firsthand. I said to you, I've taken taxis before.
Yeah.
I've seen them wave at cops at roadblocks, in an unroadworthy vehicle.
Absolutely.
That is clearly visibly unroadworthy. Didn't even get stopped, and you know that cop has been paid off.
And my thing is, what scared me the most is the drivers themselves say that the cops now know this. There's almost an unspoken emphasis on their part of the cops to stop taxis because they know they'll make a quick buck from a bribe from them, and that's completely unacceptable when that same government then says, we need to crack down on these guys. Well, it's a two-way street.
Well, that's the thing. They can't crack down on these guys because their own police force is corrupt. Right? What that police force should be doing is, as I said, police unroadworthy vehicles, police rules of the road. Right, and I don't think you have to get too strict on them, in terms of where they can stop and whatnot, because frankly they are efficient. And if you work with them as another driver, they'll work with you. I've never had grief from taxis. They always let me in, I let them in.
Funny enough, you're not the only one who said that. Yeah,
it's really no stress to me. And then the big thing is dealing with anti-competitive behaviour. Right, so when there is violence or fights over routes. Right, the government needs to step in and say, well, look, nobody has monopolies over routes. Right? You need to let everyone play, and then start arrest these guys, prosecute these guys, find them. And that's where we have a problem, and that's where I don't think the police really have the capacity to deal with the taxi industry. And that should have happened 20, 30 years ago. That's when they first started deregulating the taxis. That's what they should have done instead of saying, well, no, we're going to sort of co-opt the taxi associations and make the taxi associations set the rules in terms of route monopolies and who can and can't have access to the industry.
I think just as we maybe zoom in a little bit more on this last point, because I think it's super important. It's the critical point, isn't it? Insofar as you cannot have, and the owners themselves say this, you cannot have an industry, you can't have a business if you don't have the protection of property, their property.
Yes.
The having a fair arbiter and a regulator who allows competitors to compete fairly. And the last point they make is law enforcement that also protects them and the customer or the commuter, because they're actually quite mindful of that, to say, if you have law enforcement that is trustworthy, where essentially people feel the state, what is this point Gideon Hubert makes a lot? The idea that police have a moral obligation to enforce the law. I can't think of the term. Then you can't have an industry where everybody feels like they have a stake in it and they can play fairly. That's where the violence comes in, because then it becomes if I side with this guy and we all group and we become the biggest bullies, then we can sort of control the market.
Look, you've got to remember that people generally have an innate sense of fairness, and I mean, I've also spoken to a lot of taxi drivers. You get the idea, and you find that in any business, people know what is fair business and what isn't fair business. People know what is fair competition and what isn't fair. And it's only when they see unfair competition, where they feel that they don't have any other way and any other option, that's when they start resorting to criminal behaviour, right? To violence, taking out competitors, whatever. And I think that's what's happening with the taxi industry. So if you can, as you say, if you can level the playing field, make sure there's fair competition, and protect the taxi industry's lives, liberty, and property. That's, I think, how you're going to get an industry that runs much better, much safer for passengers, much safer for drivers and owners, and can go from strength to strength. Yeah. Because I'd really love to see this industry thrive.
You and I both.
And get bigger.
Absolutely. And it's funny, we were sort of having a chat off air, how a lot of the bad behaviors you see in the taxi industry stem from a complete failure of what should be the state's responsibility. Yes. For instance, we showed you images in episode 1, where one of the owners actually literally he built his own security company just to be able to create, or rather have armed personnel. I mean, there's a pussyfoot around this, armed personnel to protect his own property. I mean, because the state wasn't playing this role. Yeah. And you can only deal with that element of it, including the more legal and illegal side of it, because there is the illegal sort of like underground hitman environment, if the state actually just plays its damn role. But maybe I'm overemphasizing this point now.
There's a historical problem with that as well. There's a historical reason why people don't trust the police. They've never trusted the police, right? And especially in the taxi industry, which sort of comes out of the apartheid era, was very involved in the bus strikes and the liberation movements. They didn't trust the police then. They don't trust the police now. They don't believe that the police have their safety and interests at heart. But that's not only true for the taxi industry. I think that's true for a lot of us. When I see traffic police on the road, I don't think that they have road safety in mind.
That's right.
That they're there to protect me. Right? I think they're there. I think they're there to trap me and find me and make money out of me. I don't feel safe around the police, and a lot of people in the taxi industry don't feel safe around the police either.
Absolutely. Ivo, as we maybe grind the conversation to a conclusion, let's look at some of the recommendations you make. I think some innovative recommendations you make in terms of saying, hey, how do we better this industry? How do we work with it? And really, how do we empower the commuter also to be able to choose freely what sort of transport they want to take? Yeah. And if there is a more efficient one, give them empower them to choose that and to be able to use that. Top 4, I think, suggestions you make, 3 actually, that you make in the report. Do you want to quickly go through?
Yeah, well, I think the one thing is to level the playing field in terms of subsidies. Yeah. Right. I think it's a huge problem that trains and buses are subsidised, whereas the taxi industry is not. Either give the taxi industry subsidies, and given that the government doesn't have any money anyway, rather remove the subsidies from trains and buses. Let them run at the costs that they actually have, and then we'll see how the industry can develop from there. We'll see what makes sense in terms of servicing with trains. I would imagine that in Cape Town, for example, some train lines would be quite profitable and would make a lot of sense.
Southern suburbs comes to mind.
Would take a lot of traffic off the roads.
Absolutely.
A lot of people would choose to take trains. I used to when I lived in Cape Town 25 years ago. And then same with buses. Some routes will be great for buses, and others not. And then let the taxis compete on a level playing field. I think that is a very, very important part. Then the other thing is, I think the listen to the industry. Yeah. Listen to the people who are, and not just the owners, not just the associations or the mother bodies or Santico. Listen to the individual owners and the drivers and the passengers. What do they want out of the taxi industry? What will and won't they accept? When you think about modernizing the industry, you might think, it should run like Uber, or it should run, with ride-hailing apps, and people can see where the taxis are and so on. Is that going to happen? Is that practical? Is it even remotely feasible? I don't think so. But listen to people on the ground. What do they think? What do they think will make them safer? Will make it more convenient for them? And then, as we spoke about before, I think set the rules in a way that you don't issue monopolies over routes by issuing operator licenses, and you don't make these operator licenses dependent on the say-so of a taxi association. Remove the taxi association altogether, because I don't see it's like when I have a driver's permit. Why should I have the permission of some or other private association before I can have a driver's license? No, that's between me and the bureaucrats. That's between me and the government. Everyone should have an absolutely equal access to those sort of licenses. And the same with taxi operator licenses. If you meet the requirements, right? You have roadworthy vehicles, you have drivers with PDP licenses, etc. Then you can be given an operator license. It doesn't restrict you in your routes. You can go wherever you want. And then the police comes in and enforces basic laws that apply to you and me.
That's right.
You know, I mean, I can't go and shoot my rival journalists because I think they charge too little, and therefore they're now taking food out of my mouth.
Right.
You know, it doesn't work that way. And if I tried, I would get arrested.
And perhaps I will, as a final recommendation, and I wanted you to flesh this one out, if possible. I think the report makes mention of, on the issue of subsidies, which I'm generally not a fan of as a classical liberal, but I mean, we operate in a world of a kind that it is, and in a world of a kind that it is, there's subsidies. There is a recommendation, I think, in the report that you shift subsidies away from giving it to the operators, that is the taxi, bus, or the train, and perhaps even looking at giving it directly to the consumer himself, or commuter, himself. What was the rationale behind that?
Well, that would be great. You know, back in the 70s, 60s, 50s, when they started bus subsidies for the for black commuters in the townships, the rationale was simply that on typical black salaries, you couldn't afford transport, right? Therefore, subsidize the fees, and it was usually done through employers. Actually, employers used to receive the subsidy and then pay that subsidy to their staff. That also gave the apartheid government some control, so that people who didn't have jobs didn't have a subsidy to get into town, because we didn't want black people in town that didn't have to be there, kind of thing.
Nature of apartheid.
Nature of apartheid.
Where's that nonsense?
But I think it's far more important that passengers themselves, and perhaps on a means-tested basis, or that they get that subsidy, and
almost like a transport voucher.
Almost like a transport voucher, right? And then decide how they want to spend it, right? So that it's valid for taxis, it's valid for Uber, it's valid for public buses, it's valid for trains. However you want to choose your transport, your subsidy will be valid, and I think that's. Same arguments are going to school vouchers and health vouchers, for that matter. I think that would be a great improvement to the way the system works now.
And I think maybe as I sort of sit here and I'm thinking about it, let me put that suggestion to commuters themselves. I'll probably do a 4th episode, I just thought about it now, where we talk to consumers, especially those commuters who, because you also make mention in the report that, there's a disincentive of a taxi route being incredibly long. They'd rather give sort of short routes, let's say from Sedgefield to Knysna, from Knysna to blah, 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 and the next route. You might find, for instance, where if there is a route by the way, guys, we are shooting this in Ivo's home, so, there's homely activities happening. No, come through, no worries. You might find, for instance, that someone who takes a taxi from Sedgewood to Knysna goes, look, that's super cheap, or takes a train, for argument's sake, that's super cheap, but once I need to take a taxi or a bus, which is a little bit more expensive, from Knysna to George, they'll use their transport voucher there. Would that sort of be the sort of flexibility you'd allow with a transport voucher like that?
Yes, you would. Funny enough, if that sort of system was implemented, that might actually become a strong motive for introducing smart cards. For more formalizing the industry. Because now people would have to go, somehow they would have to get that voucher.
That's right.
So how would they do that? By buying a subsidized transport smart card. Right? So you might actually, all these sort of technology advances that people think might help the taxi industry, might actually be able to introduce them through a voucher system of that sort.
Absolutely. I think it's worth having a look at in terms of really speaking to the innovations that could go into this industry. Ivo, super thank you to you for allowing me into your home to talk to you.
Absolutely.
As your maybe final say, just your final thoughts, if any, on the industry, and of course, how do we find you on your social media?
Well, I think the image that people have of the industry, I think, is very often mistaken. When you're outside of the industry, all you see is aggressive drivers on the road. You see unroadworthy vehicles. Even as passengers, they often just see where they fear for their safety sometimes. When you actually start looking into the industry, most of it, the majority of it, is actually very professional, very competent. The drivers aren't idiots. They really understand their business. They're very streetwise. It's really a very impressive industry that sort of grew organically out of what was really a very evil system of apartheid.
That's right.
And I think once you start looking at the industry in that way, I think people might have a lot more sympathy to the industry, towards the industry, and feel that it really is worth trying to improve the industry and trying to listen to the industry. Because it serves a real need. It creates a lot of jobs, and it serves millions upon millions of people every day in terms of getting to work and back. So I think it's a very important industry. If you want to get hold of me on social media, well, I'm Ivo Vegter on Twitter at Ivo Vegter.
I'll put those details on the screen,
and that's easy enough to find me there.
Absolutely, Ivo. Thank you very much. Much appreciate that.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching essentially what was this part 3. Maybe I moved to the idea of there being a part 4 now, but thank you for watching this, and I hope you've enjoyed the journey that I've taken you on thus far in terms of speaking to the actual role players in the industry, so that you get an insight into that and we start advocating for policy approaches that really encourage the freedom to choose, not only for commuters and customers, but also the freedom to operate, to trade freely as a taxi entrepreneur, whether you're an owner or a driver owner, because you do get that also, and the various associated entrepreneurs that feed off of this wonderful, wonderful industry. And of course, as Ivo made mention in the last segment, how do you modernize it, improve it, and make it more compliant in a framework of the rule of law and law and order? Guys, thank you so much for watching. You've been watching The Big Liberty Show, the Taxiland mini-series. I'll see you on the next one.